In the spring of 1812, amidst the dense, untamed woodlands of southern Illinois, a large, ominous structure began to rise from the earth. Logs were felled and shaped with unnatural speed. Brick was transported from unknown sources. Locals whispered in taverns and church halls that the land itself had protested. The trees groaned when they were cut, and birds no longer sang in the area. The place felt heavy, as if the very air clung to your skin like wet cloth. And at the center of it all was one man, Ezekiel Blackburn. Ezekiel wasn't like other men of the frontier. He spoke in thunderous sermons and claimed he'd been chosen by divine voices that visited him in his dreams. With long, piercing eyes and a towering stature, Ezekiel had the kind of presence that made grown men shrink and women avert their gaze. He arrived in Illinois with his pale-skinned wife, Margaret, and their two sons, Silas and Abel, who rarely spoke and never smiled. They were a strange, silent family, always dressed in black, always watching. Ezekiel purchased 200 acres of secluded forest land under a new name, the New Covenant Society for Enlightenment and Discipline, but locals would come to know it as Blackburn Academy. The stated mission was noble: to provide free faith-based education to gifted but underprivileged children. "We will shape the future," Ezekiel had proclaimed in his first public appearance, standing atop a crude wooden stage in the center of town. "We will take the lost, the broken, the wandering lambs, and bring them to the light." And so they came. Children from surrounding towns and counties arrived in droves. Poor families, especially those struggling after the War of 1812, were eager to give their children a better future, even if it meant parting ways. The Blackburns provided food, shelter, and education, all for free. To the untrained eye, Blackburn Academy was a miracle. The building itself was massive, 3 floors tall with a central bell tower and adjoining dormitories. The chapel at the heart of the school was darkly beautiful, lit only by candlelight and stained glass that filtered sunlight into crimson and gold shadows. But even in its early days, something felt off. The school had no official curriculum. There were no visiting inspectors or community partnerships. Students were not allowed to leave the grounds once enrolled. Mail was tightly controlled. Letters home were written during designated hours under supervision, and many parents noticed the messages grew shorter, stranger, more detached. "God is good," some would say. "We are being prepared." Others stopped sending letters altogether. Margaret Blackburn, who served as the headmistress, rarely interacted with the children directly, but when she did, her words were slow and rehearsed, like scripture memorized long ago. She often spoke of sacrifice, cleansing, and the cost of purity. Teachers, if they could be called that, were mostly hand-picked members of Ezekiel's traveling religious sect, men and women who owed him their lives and possibly their minds. They referred to themselves as the harvesters. Every morning at 5:00 a.m., the massive bell would ring through the forest, waking both students and nearby wildlife. The children would line up in the cold stone courtyard, dressed in heavy wool uniforms, and repeat the school's motto in unison: "To obey is to be loved is to suffer, and through suffering we see truth." That phrase was etched into every wooden desk, carved into the walls, and even engraved onto the iron gate that surrounded the property. As the school's population grew, so did the rumors. Farmers reported strange lights in the sky above the academy. Trappers claimed to find mutilated animals along the property lines. One former laborer who helped build the East Dormitory said he was forced to dig unusually deep into the foundation, then told to pour concrete over something that smelled of iron and death. No one dared ask questions, because Ezekiel Blackburn held power, not just religious power, but psychological and financial influence. He funded local churches, provided food during droughts, and healed the sick with folk remedies and divine touch. He wasn't just a headmaster. He was a prophet to some and a tyrant to others. But one thing was clear: Blackburn Academy was never just a school. It was a temple, a machine, a trap designed to consume the innocent under the disguise of holiness, and in the years that followed, its true purpose would be revealed, one missing child at a time. Between the years 1813 and 1816, the landscape of southern Illinois darkened, not from storms or plague, but from a growing silence no one dared speak of openly. It started slowly, subtly. A boy named Elijah Mercer, age 10, failed to return home for the summer. His parents, humble farmers from Franklin County, wrote to Blackburn Academy. They received a reply weeks later, typewritten and signed by Margaret Blackburn herself. Your son has chosen to remain with us for deeper training. He is undergoing a divine purification process and asks not to be disturbed. It sounded strange. Elijah could barely read, let alone write such things. But the parents, poor and uneducated, didn't press further. Who were they to question a respected religious family like the Blackburns? And then came another disappearance. This time, a girl named Marianne Fulton, age 12, whose older sister had previously graduated from Blackburn Academy without issue. Marianne was bright, curious, and eager to learn, but within 6 months, she stopped responding to letters. Her family traveled to the school, only to be greeted by a stoic gatekeeper. Marianne has found higher calling, he said, not meeting their eyes. She no longer belongs to the world. The parents were turned away with no explanation, no proof of her well-being, just a Bible verse handed to them on parchment. He who loses his life for my sake will find it. Matthew 10:39. Soon, whispers began to circulate in the nearby towns. How many children had gone missing? Was it 5, 10, a dozen? But fear bound their tongues. Ezekiel Blackburn's reputation was formidable. He was seen preaching beside governors and hosting clergy from across state lines. Challenging him felt like accusing God himself. Still, not everyone stayed silent. In late 1814, a local tavern owner named Jonas Temple compiled a list. By his own accounting, 17 children from families who lived within 100 miles of the school had failed to return. Some, he noted, had even stopped appearing in the school's rare group drawings or Sunday procession visits. Jonas took his findings to the local sheriff, but the sheriff, a devout member of Blackburn's church, tore the paper in half. You speak of things above your station, he warned. Go home, pray, forget this. Jonas didn't forget. 2 weeks later, his tavern mysteriously burned to the ground in the middle of the night. He and his wife barely escaped. No cause was ever determined. The townsfolk understood. To question the Blackburns was to invite judgment. Inside the school, the remaining children noticed the absences too, but were trained not to speak of them. If a bunk went empty, they were told the student had ascended. If a seat at morning prayer remained vacant, it was because the pupil had displeased the Lord and was sent for cleansing. Every so often, strange carts would arrive in the dead of night, covered in black cloth, pulled by horses with hollow eyes and unnatural silence. The children called it the carriage of mercy. It always left full. It never returned empty. But perhaps the most chilling part of these disappearances wasn't who vanished, but what happened afterward. Several parents who demanded to see their children in person were eventually handed letters, allegedly from their own sons or daughters. The writing, however, felt eerily generic. Repetitive phrases like "I am at peace," and "this place has shown me truth," appeared again and again, regardless of the child's background or age. Some letters bore names misspelled. Others were smeared with ink or even what appeared to be dried blood along the margins. In one letter, a mother swore she found tiny claw marks beneath the seal, as if something inside the envelope had tried to escape. Despite these horrors, the school continued to thrive publicly. Donors increased, enrollment stayed steady. Blackburn Academy's name appeared in national religious newsletters, celebrated as a model of obedience and spiritual excellence. Meanwhile, the student population within its walls grew thinner, not by lack of new admissions, but from those who simply vanished. The bell still rang every morning. The children still stood in rows chanting their daily oath. But for those with eyes to see, it was clear something unnatural was consuming them, something ancient, something tied not just to the family that ran the school, but to the very land it sat on. And deep beneath the surface, far from prying eyes, the Blackburn family was just getting started. By the winter of 1816, Blackburn Academy had earned a chilling reputation beneath its prestigious surface. On paper, it remained a sanctuary of moral instruction and advanced learning for underprivileged youth. But inside the heavy stone walls, beyond the sermon halls and prayer rooms, the true curriculum of the Blackburn family had already taken hold. A curriculum not of education, but of experimentation, submission, and terror. Ezekiel Blackburn called it the path of refinement. To the children enrolled, it was known by another name, the chamber hours. The day would begin with standard routines, prayers before sunrise, physical exercises in silence, a meager breakfast. Then classes, recitation of scripture, basic arithmetic, obedience training, but the real lessons began after dark. That was when select children, often chosen at random, were pulled from their beds by robed instructors and taken to the lower levels of the academy, a network of hidden basements and tunnels buried beneath the school's main hall. What happened in those depths was whispered about in the dormitories like ghost stories, but for the children who had endured it, it wasn't folklore, it was trauma. In these secret sessions, Abel Blackburn, the younger of the twins and a mechanical prodigy, performed what he called tests of the spirit. Using crude machinery, gears, wires, and pressure rigs, Abel subjected children to physical stress tests under the belief that pain unlocked their spiritual potential. One device involved a head cage that slowly tightened based on the speed at which a child could recite verses from the Book of Revelation. If they faltered, the tightening increased. Some children returned from these sessions with blood leaking from their ears. But this wasn't just torture, it was doctrine. Ezekiel had convinced his followers that salvation came not through grace, but through suffering that cleansed the soul. He preached that the world was filled with demons in disguise, and only the harvested could identify them. Children were told they had been chosen to become vessels of the pure fire. To achieve this, their identities had to be burned away. Memories, emotions, attachments, all removed like rot from a wound. To enforce this, Silas Blackburn, the more methodical of the twins, developed psychological programs of isolation. Children were assigned to reflection rooms, a small, windowless chambers where they were locked for hours, sometimes days, with nothing but a candle, a Bible, and a mirror. They were instructed to talk to their reflection until it disappeared. Many children emerged dazed, disoriented, some reportedly speaking in tongues, others unable to speak at all. If a child resisted or broke down, they were labeled a rejection and taken to a separate part of the academy known only as the Bellows. No child who entered the Bellows was ever seen again, but the most disturbing part of the curriculum was the ritual of ascension. Held once every season, the ritual took place during a moonless night. Children were gathered in the school chapel, where Ezekiel himself led a sermon filled with fire and frenzy. He would pace before the altar, eyes wild, proclaiming that a soul must die for the flesh to live forever. Then a name would be drawn, one student hand selected by the Blackburns. That student would be escorted to the pulpit, bathed in oil and incense, and then taken behind the altar curtain. What happened there remained a mystery. The other children were forbidden to look, and hymnals were sung loudly to drown out any sound. The next day, that student's belongings would be gone. Their bed would be made as if untouched, their name erased from the school records. Some believed the children were being killed. Others thought they were being taken somewhere deeper within the school for a second, secret phase of training. A few insisted they had seen their classmates wandering the woods at night, dressed in white robes, eyes glowing faintly, faces blank as porcelain. The Blackburns didn't view this as cruelty. They believed they were saving the world. Ezekiel kept extensive journals, where he wrote of his divine duty to raise an army of cleansed minds who could hear the voice of God without interruption. He believed that the children were vessels of future prophecy, and that the impurities of the modern world had to be purged before the age of true enlightenment could begin. By the end of 1816, more than 60 children had passed through the secret curriculum. Less than half were accounted for. Yet somehow, the academy still operated openly, protected by fear, faith, and a carefully curated illusion of piety. But beneath the prayers and perfection, the Blackburns were forging something monstrous, a generation stripped of will, rebuilt in their image and programmed to obey. And no one, not even the government, dared to stop them. By the fall of 1817, the silence surrounding Blackburn Academy had become unbearable. Too many children had vanished. Too many families had been turned away with vague letters or eerie scriptural explanations. A few brave souls whispered that something was terribly wrong, but no one had any proof, until a girl named Clara Weller escaped. Clara was 13, frail, quiet, and often overlooked. She had been enrolled at Blackburn Academy for nearly 2 years. She had survived the isolation rooms, the brutal tests of spirit, and even the terrifying moonlit rituals conducted in the chapel. But one night, when her assigned room was left unlocked, an unusual error for a place so tightly controlled, Clara slipped out. With nothing but a candle stub and torn slippers, she ran. She navigated through the surrounding forest for 2 days, surviving on rainwater and wild berries. Exhausted and bleeding from her feet, Clara collapsed at the steps of St. Joseph's Church in the nearby town of Alton. When a priest found her the next morning, she was barely conscious. Her back bore long scab over welts, her hands were covered in burns, but what she said chilled him more than anything he had ever heard. "There are children underneath the school," she whispered, "in the walls, under the floors. They don't sleep, they don't wake." The priest, Father Matheson, was a retired military chaplain, pragmatic, tough, and unafraid of darkness. He listened to Clara's account with growing horror. She spoke of stone basements filled with cages, strange humming sounds at night, children made to drink cleansing water that smelled like copper, and worst of all, a room beneath the old woodshop where the floorboards lifted like a trapdoor. She had seen bones, dozens of them. Despite the risk, Father Matheson brought the story to Sheriff Elias Connor, a lawman who had long suspected something was amiss but lacked the courage to act alone. With Clara's testimony as a guide and using an old map of the property from its early construction days, the two men decided to investigate quietly. On November 12, 1817, in the dead of night, they approached Blackburn Academy under the cover of fog. Posing as weary travelers, they waited until the evening watchmen made their rounds. Slipping into the eastern wing of the school, they located the old woodshop. The room was cold, damp, and smelled of mildew and old blood. Dust coated the tools like a burial shroud, but it was just as Clara had described. Beneath the largest work table, a square outline on the floor revealed a hidden hatch, sealed tight with rusted iron hinges. When the two men pried it open, the smell hit them first. It wasn't just decay, it was sickness. The air was thick with rot, mold, and something bitter like burning hair. Lighting a lantern, they descended the narrow stone staircase beneath the hatch. What they found at the bottom would forever haunt both men, a mass grave. The underground chamber was wide, almost like a crypt. Stacked in neat rows, side by side, were dozens of small skeletons, each one shackled by the ankles or wrists to the floor. Some still wore pieces of fabric, child-sized uniforms of gray and white. Others clutched crude, carved crosses or had symbols burned into their skulls. Upon closer inspection, many of the bones had deep, unnatural cuts, suggesting not just death, but ritual mutilation. At the far end of the chamber stood an altar, made of stone and stained with something black and crusted. Upon it lay open journals, some belonging to Ezekiel Blackburn, others to his sons. The pages were filled with disturbing language. The soul must be extracted through pain. Their purity fuels the flame. Each child a vessel, each death a prayer. But perhaps most terrifying of all were the dolls. Lining one wall were shelves upon shelves of grotesque little figurines, crafted from bone, hair, and ash. Each doll bore a name etched into its forehead, names that matched the missing children reported over the years. Father Matheson, barely able to breathe, crossed himself as he whispered, "These aren't graves, they're trophies." Sheriff Connor wanted to report the finding immediately, but the priest insisted on caution. They needed witnesses, proof, and time was short, because someone in the academy had surely heard them. Before dawn, they returned to Alton and raised the alarm. But by the time authorities returned to Blackburn Academy that afternoon, the building was engulfed in flames. The fire spread fast, unnaturally so, consuming the wooden structures and collapsing the bell tower in under an hour. The surrounding forest lit up with red light as smoke billowed into the sky. No bodies were found inside. The Blackburn family was gone. Only the grave remained, buried beneath ash and soot, hidden beneath what once was called a house of God. But now everyone knew it had always been a house of horrors. The discovery of the underground chamber beneath Blackburn Academy should have marked the beginning of justice, but in truth it marked the beginning of a cover-up. The world should have witnessed a trial, one of the most disturbing and far-reaching in the young history of America. It should have brought the Blackburn family's reign of horror to a public end, but that trial never happened. The morning after the fire consumed Blackburn Academy, all that remained was a field of smoldering ash. The charred bell tower collapsed like a broken crucifix. Dozens of onlookers from nearby towns gathered silently, watching the smoke drift toward the heavens. They had heard rumors, seen flames, and some, those whose children never returned, had come hoping to reclaim something, anything, but there were no bodies in the wreckage, not of the students, not of the staff. And most alarmingly, not of the Blackburn family. Sheriff Elias Connor, who had discovered the mass grave only hours before, led the initial investigation, but his authority was quickly overrun by state officials, most of whom had received sizable donations from Ezekiel Blackburn over the years. Reverend Ephraim Caldwell, a high-ranking church figure with political ambitions, was dispatched from Springfield to review and assist the investigation. Within days, Father Matheson was removed from his role and warned to remain silent. The journals recovered from the underground tomb, filled with graphic descriptions of child sacrifice, soul manipulation, and divine refinement, mysteriously disappeared from the evidence lockbox. When Sheriff Connor demanded answers, he was reassigned to a district 3 counties away and stripped of his badge, quietly, efficiently. Soon after, the entire investigation was declared inconclusive. Newspapers published a short, sterile statement. On November 13, 1817, Blackburn Academy was tragically lost to a fire of unknown origin. No fatalities confirmed. School leadership presumed missing. Rumors of misconduct remain unverified. The public, those not directly touched by the horror, moved on. Another tragedy buried beneath headlines about war debts, frontier expansion, and presidential politics. But those who had lost children, those who had seen the truth, they never forgot. A group of grieving parents attempted to organize a civil suit against the estate of Ezekiel Blackburn, but their case was thrown out for lack of living defendants. And when one particularly vocal mother, Sarah Clymer, staged a protest outside the county courthouse with a wooden cross bearing the names of 19 missing children, she was arrested for disturbing the peace. She later died in a house fire under suspicious circumstances. Survivors were silenced. The public record was whitewashed. The land on which the school had stood was officially marked unsuitable for development, due to soil instability from fire damage. It was fenced off by the state and left untouched, though some claim to have seen men in black coats entering and exiting the ruins late at night, always carrying heavy crates, but the whispers never stopped. There were stories, passed down from family to family, whispered in church basements and taverns, about what really happened during those final days. Some claimed the Blackburns hadn't perished in the fire, but had faked their deaths and escaped through an underground tunnel that led deep into the forest. Others believed Ezekiel had completed his great ritual and offered the children's souls in exchange for immortality, ascending to another plane. A few said the family had merely changed identities and that descendants of the Blackburn line still lived among the townsfolk, watching, waiting. And then there were the darker tales. Farmers reported strange animal mutilations in the surrounding area. Hikers claimed to hear children singing from the woods at night. One hunter stumbled upon a hidden cellar nearly 2 miles from the academy's ruins. Inside were bloodstains, broken shackles, and the word "obey" carved into the stone. To this day, no legal conviction has ever been made in relation to the Blackburn Academy case. No one has stood trial. No public acknowledgement has ever been given to the dozens, possibly hundreds, of children who entered that school and never returned, and yet the truth remains, buried beneath redacted documents. Hidden inside, burned journal fragments smuggled away by Father Matheson. Etched into crude gravestones placed by broken parents who still wander the fields outside Alton, searching for names that never made it into the census. It wasn't justice, it wasn't closure, it was silence, because Blackburn Academy was never just a place, it was a system, one built on fear, control, and complicity. And while the walls burned to the ground, the ideology that built them never quite died. It simply changed form. Decades passed. The ruins of Blackburn Academy slowly surrendered to nature. The once grand bell tower had collapsed completely, swallowed by ivy and moss. The forest crept inward, reclaiming the land with clawed roots and thick undergrowth, as if trying to erase what had happened. But some things don't stay buried, not even in ash. In 1937, over 120 years after the fire, a team of government-sanctioned surveyors was sent to assess forgotten lands for potential development. Among the listed properties was a curious, untouched plot in southern Illinois officially classified as a derelict religious site. Few on the team had ever heard of Blackburn Academy. Fewer still knew its history. The team, led by Dr. Miriam Halbrook, a young archaeologist with a reputation for solving historical puzzles, expected little more than broken stones and debris. What they found, however, would reignite a long, buried nightmare. While clearing out vines from what remained of the school's east wing, a crew member discovered a partially intact cellar door, hidden beneath decades of dirt and decay. It creaked open into darkness. Against protocol and driven by curiosity, Dr. Halbrook and her assistant descended into the cold, stale air. Beneath the surface, preserved in chilling stillness, was an undisturbed chamber. Unlike the original grave site found in 1817, this one appeared to have been sealed deliberately, with iron prayer cloths and dozens of nails hammered into the doorway. It took nearly 2 hours to remove them all. Inside, the walls were lined with bookshelves, each stacked with brittle leather-bound journals. Some were authored by Silas Blackburn, the more methodical twin, whose writings revealed terrifying depth. One entry read, "Pain is the only language God respects. We have taught the children his voice, the others will follow." There were diagrams, crude anatomical sketches, demonstrating how to unlock the mind through various forms of deprivation and stress. There were records of ascensions, listing names and dates, along with strange notes like "voice shattered," "soul did not fracture," "retry," and "doll forged successfully." In a locked cabinet near the altar, Dr. Halbrook found something else, a small wooden box blackened with time. Inside were 2 dolls meticulously crafted from bone, cloth, and human hair. Both were labeled, one read Mary Ann Fulton, the other Elijah Mercer. Names that should have been forgotten, names that still haunted families in the county, even 6 generations later. Dr. Halbrook, horrified, handed over the artifacts to the state archives. But shortly after submitting her findings, the investigation was abruptly shut down. A government official visited the site, declared it a biohazard concern, and had the cellar permanently sealed with concrete. The journals, the artifacts, and even the land survey reports were classified. Word spread among locals, conspiracy theories surged again, and the whispers returned. Children from nearby farms claimed they could hear faint singing in the woods at night, off-key hymns with no clear source. Some said they saw figures dressed in tattered 19th century school uniforms, wandering near the ruins with glowing eyes and stitched mouths. In 1942, a group of high school boys dared one another to spend the night at the site. Only one returned, pale, unresponsive, and unable to speak for 3 days. When he finally spoke, he said only, "They're still in there. They're waiting for the bell." That same year, a traveling pastor named Rev. Tatum tried to hold an exorcism ritual at the property. He brought his congregation to the edge of the woods and prayed for 2 hours. As he raised his hands to declare the ground cleansed, a flock of crows descended from the sky, attacking the group. 5 were injured. Totem suffered a stroke 2 days later. People stayed away after that. To this day, no construction has been attempted on the land. Every effort is mysteriously denied, cancelled, or redirected. Some call it superstition, others call it divine protection, but the locals, especially the old families, know better. They say that on moonless nights, if you stand near the center of where the bell tower once stood, you can still hear it ring. Not loudly, but softly, distantly, as if beneath the ground, as if calling something home. And then there are the letters. Over the years, descendants of those who once attended the academy began receiving handwritten notes in their mailboxes, despite no return address, no postage. Each letter bears the same phrase, "You are of the vessel, we remember." Authorities have no leads. Some think it's a cruel prank. Others believe it's a sign that the Blackburn legacy isn't over just sleeping, waiting, watching, and whispering from the ashes.